The black sedan was parked in the same spot for the third morning in a row, engine running, windows dark enough that Marlene Hayes couldn't see who was inside. Only that someone was watching bus stop 4 on Larkspur Street, watching it the way a person watches something they intend to take. Marlene pulled the bus to the curb at 7:18, exactly on schedule, and counted heads the way she always did. 11 children climbed the steps. The 12th was supposed to be a quiet 9-year-old named Eli Marchetti, who never spoke above a whisper and always sat 2 seats behind the driver, close enough to see the road. Eli wasn't there. His guardian, a stiff, silent woman named Ruth who usually walked him to the curb, wasn't there either. Marlene held the doors open 4 extra seconds. It wasn't procedure. It was instinct. The same instinct that made her check her own brake lines before every shift instead of trusting the district's maintenance log. Something about the empty stretch of sidewalk didn't sit right. Then a man in a gray coat stepped out of the sedan. He crossed the street without hurrying, which was somehow worse than if he'd run. He held up a folded paper like it was a badge. "I'm here for Eli Marchetti," he said. "New arrangement. You can call the district office to confirm." Marlene had driven this route for 6 years. She knew every guardian, every emergency contact, every child's allergy and afraid of the dark habit written in the file binder she kept behind her seat, not because the district required it, but because she'd decided a long time ago that the 26 kids on her bus were, for 40 minutes a day, entirely her responsibility. She had never seen this man's name in Eli's file. "Ma'am," he said softer now. "It's a simple handoff." Marlene looked past him at the empty sidewalk, at the sedan's tinted windows, at the fact that Eli, a boy so careful he memorized bus schedules for fun, had not shown up to a bus that ran like a clock. Something was wrong in a way that procedure wasn't built to catch. "I don't release a child to anyone who isn't listed," she said, and closed the doors. The man's expression didn't crack, but his hand went to his coat pocket, and for 1 second Marlene saw something that looked less like paperwork and more like a countdown. She pulled away from the curb 3 minutes behind schedule, radioed dispatch that stop 4 needed a welfare check, and made herself a promise she didn't fully understand yet. Whatever was happening to that boy, she wasn't going to be the adult who looked away because it was easier. Halfway down the block in her mirror, she saw the sedan pull out behind her. Not fast, not obvious, just close enough to follow. And in the back of the bus, tucked into the seat Eli usually sat in, she found a backpack he must have left behind days ago. Inside it was a school ID with his photograph, and a last name that didn't match any record she had ever seen. Marlene sat with that for a moment, engine idling, 25 other children waiting to be delivered safely to a school that had no idea anything was wrong. Whatever this was, it hadn't started that morning. It had been building for weeks, in a sedan she'd noticed and dismissed, in a boy who'd quietly asked about emergency exits like he already knew he might need one. Marlene Hayes had been driving Route 14 since her son Caleb was small enough to ride it himself. Now he was 11. Prone to asthma attacks that could turn a normal afternoon into an emergency room bill, and entirely dependent on the insurance that came with his mother's job at Ridgeview Unified. She didn't have savings to fall back on. She had a route, a paycheck, and a habit of checking every belt and hose on her bus before her morning shift, because she'd learned early that nobody else was going to check it for her. She wasn't an especially trusting woman. 6 years on the road had taught her that most adults who claimed authority over a child either had the paperwork to prove it or they didn't, and the ones who talked fastest usually had the least of it. That instinct had gotten her 3 formal complaints from the district for unauthorized delays. Complaints that were really just Marlene refusing to hand a child to someone whose story didn't add up. Her supervisor, a tired man named Griggs, had warned her twice already that year. "One more incident report," he'd said, "and I have to pull you off the route." He didn't say it cruelly. He said it like a man who also had bills. Eli Marchetti had been riding with her for 4 months, ever since he transferred in mid-year with almost no paperwork and a guardian, Ruth, who signed forms but never made small talk. He sat behind Marlene's seat, watched the road like he was memorizing an escape route, and spoke maybe 6 words a week. Once in October he'd asked her, quietly like it cost him something, whether the bus had a way out if it ever needed one. She'd shown him the rear emergency door and the window releases, and he'd nodded like he was filing it away for later use, not like a boy being curious. She didn't know then that Eli's real last name was Reyes, or that the man who quietly paid for his private tutoring and his medical bills through 3 layers of shell arrangements was a man named Dante Reyes. A man other people in this city didn't say the word boss about out loud, but meant it every time his name came up. What Marlene did know, because Eli had let it slip once, was that he had an uncle who worked a lot and wasn't allowed to visit school events. She'd assumed a difficult custody situation. She had not assumed anything close to the truth. The man who visited Eli's school twice that spring under the name Mr. Ortolan was, on paper, a family attorney handling a guardianship matter. He wore good suits and remembered the receptionist's birthday. He was, in every visible way, more reasonable than the silent, watchful woman who usually walked Eli to the bus. Teachers liked him. The principal took his calls personally. None of them knew that Vincent Ortolan had spent 11 years as Dante Reyes's most trusted lieutenant, the man who handled every uncomfortable arrangement Dante didn't want his name attached to, and that lately, in rooms Dante never saw, Vincent had begun describing his boss to the organization's older captains as a man too soft to keep them safe. A man who kept a nephew in a public school instead of behind real security. A man whose sentiment was becoming a liability. Marlene noticed 2 small things that spring, without understanding what either one meant. The first was a thin, coin-sized magnet stuck to the inside of her rear wheel well, discovered only because she ran her hand along the frame during a routine brake check, and felt something that didn't belong on district-issued equipment. She peeled it off, turned it over, found no manufacturer's mark, and dropped it in her toolbox, meaning to ask the mechanic about it later. She forgot. Sat there for weeks. The second was smaller still, Eli's backpack tag, glimpsed once when it slipped from its usual pocket, printed with a last name that didn't match the one on his enrollment form. She'd assumed a stepfather situation, filed it away, and said nothing, because it wasn't her business to correct a child's paperwork. She had one good ordinary moment with him that spring that she'd remember later for how normal it was. It was raining, the bus heater was broken, and instead of complaining, Eli had quietly taught the 2 kids next to him a card game with rules he clearly invented on the spot, patient in a way most 9-year-olds weren't. Marlene had watched him in the mirror and thought, not for the first time, that whatever was going on in that boy's home life, somebody had at least taught him how to be kind under pressure. There was one more detail Marlene almost missed, because it seemed unrelated at the time. Ridgeview's front desk security guard Harold had started walking out to the bus loop most mornings that spring, always with a coffee in hand, always asking the same easy question: how the roads were, whether traffic was bad on Larkspur. She'd thought it was friendliness. In hindsight, months later, she'd understand it had been reconnaissance, gathered one polite sentence at a time by a man who didn't fully understand what he was helping to build. She didn't know yet that the tracking magnet under her wheel well and the man in the gray coat outside Stop 4 were connected. She didn't know that Vincent Ortolan needed Eli found, isolated, and used as the one thing Dante Reyes had never learned to protect properly. Because Dante had spent 9 years protecting his nephew by disappearing him into an ordinary life and telling almost no one the truth, including, eventually, Eli himself. All Marlene knew, that morning she found the backpack with the wrong name inside it, was that a boy she'd promised herself she wouldn't fail was somewhere out there without her, and that the sedan behind her bus wasn't slowing down. Marlene didn't finish her route. For stops past Larkspur Street, she pulled the bus into the empty lot behind Ridgeview Community Center. Off schedule, off record, the kind of decision that would show up on Griggs's desk by lunch, and radioed dispatch with a version of the truth flexible enough to buy her 20 minutes. Mechanical delay, checking a fault light. There was no fault light. There was a backpack with a stranger's name on it, sitting in the seat behind her own, and a sedan that had followed her for 6 blocks before peeling off at the light like it had gotten what it needed just from watching where she went. Before she called anyone, she tried the obvious route first, the one procedure actually recommended. She called the district office directly and asked them to verify the man in the gray coat against Eli's guardianship file. The woman on the other end put her on hold for 4 full minutes, came back apologetic, and told her the file showed a recent update. A new authorized contact added just that week, matching the description Marlene had given. It should have reassured her. Instead, it told her something worse. Whoever was behind this had already gotten inside the paperwork itself, which meant the system she was supposed to trust couldn't be trusted at all. She hung up without confirming anything and decided the file was wrong before she'd even proven it. She opened the backpack the rest of the way. Under a folder of math worksheets, she found a laminated card, the kind used for emergency medical information, listing an allergy to penicillin, a pediatrician's number, and, at the bottom, a second name scratched out in pen and rewritten. Not Eli Marchetti. Eli Reyes. She'd seen enough school files to know that guardians didn't cross out and rewrite a child's legal name unless something about that name needed hiding. Her phone was already in her hand when the gray-coated man reappeared, on foot this time, walking the tree line at the edge of the lot like he had all the patience in the world and knew exactly where she'd stop. Marlene locked the bus doors from the inside. A habit, not a plan, and looked at the emergency contact card again. There was a second number under the pediatrician's, unlabeled, that Ruth had once told her, almost in passing, to use, if you can't reach me, and it's about Eli specifically. Marlene had never needed it before. She used it now. The man who answered had a voice that didn't waste words. Who is this? My name is Marlene Hayes. I drive Eli's school bus. Ruth didn't bring him to the stop this morning, and there's a man outside my bus right now claiming he has authority to take him, and I don't believe him. She kept her voice level, the same voice she used to calm a bus full of panicking kids during a fire drill gone wrong. I have Eli's backpack. I don't have Eli. There was a silence on the line that told her more than words would have. Then, where are you? She told him. She also told him because it felt important. I'm not handing this boy to anyone I can't verify, including you, until I know he's safe. Understood, the man said, and something in the way he said it, controlled, immediate, like a man used to being obeyed and not used to being told what he would and wouldn't be allowed to do, told Marlene she'd just spoken to someone with real power, for the first time in her ordinary, overworked, insurance-anxious life. The gray-coated man tried the bus's front door handle once, found it locked, and stepped back, making a call of his own. Marlene watched him through the windshield the way she'd watch a wasp inside a closed car, not panicking but not looking away either. Within 11 minutes, 2 black SUVs pulled into the lot, and the gray-coated man walked to his sedan without a word and drove off in the opposite direction, unhurried, like a man who'd simply run out of time rather than lost. The man who stepped out of the first SUV was tall, unshowy in an expensive way, and moved like every motion had already been decided before his body caught up. He didn't introduce himself right away. He looked at the bus, at Marlene through the windshield, and then briefly at the backpack in her lap when she cracked the door. Where is he? Dante Reyes said. I don't know, Marlene said, and watched something behind his composed face genuinely fracture for half a second. He wasn't at the stop. Ruth wasn't either. Have his bag. I have a name on a medical card that doesn't match his file. And I have a man in a gray coat who's been watching my route for 3 days and just walked off the second you arrived. One of the men from the second SUV came forward and murmured something to Dante about the district's file update, the new authorized contact that had appeared that week. Dante's expression didn't change, but Marlene saw his hand tighten briefly around his phone. Whoever had reached into that guardianship file had done it recently, and cleanly, in a way that suggested access rather than a lucky guess. Dante's jaw tightened, but his voice stayed even. You should not be involved in this. I already am, Marlene said, and heard her own voice harden into something she didn't recognize. Not fear but resolve. I made that boy a promise without ever saying it out loud, and I'm not walking away from it because you'd rather I did. She didn't know yet what she had just stepped into. She only knew she wasn't getting back on schedule, and she wasn't handing this over to anyone until she saw Eli safe with her own eyes. By the time Marlene reached the school district office that afternoon, Griggs was already holding a printed incident report with her name at the top, and a man from legal polished patient, introduced simply as a family representative for the Marchetti guardianship, was sitting in the chair beside his desk like he'd been expecting to sit there for weeks. It was Vincent Ortolin. Marlene didn't know his real function yet. She only knew he spoke the language of school administrators fluently. using words like liability and unauthorized deviation and duty of care, all delivered with a calm, reasonable smile that made her own account sound, by comparison, unstable. Ms. Hayes left her route unattended for over 20 minutes, Vincent said, not unkindly, with 25 other children on board, based on what appears to be a personal assumption about a family's private arrangements. There was a man watching that stop for 3 mornings, Marlene said. The boy didn't show. His guardian didn't show. That's not an assumption, that's a pattern. Family matters can look alarming from the outside, Vincent said, folding his hands. Custody transitions are rarely tidy. Griggs, caught between a legitimate complaint and a driver he genuinely respected, suspended Marlene from her route pending review. Not a firing, he was careful to say, but a pause, effective immediately, until the district could sort out the guardianship question. Marlene understood exactly what that meant for Caleb's coverage before she was even out of the building. Insurance ran through active employment. Pause was still a pause. She tried, before leaving the building, to get someone in the district to simply look at the guardianship file's recent edit history, the change she'd been told about on the phone that morning. The clerk who pulled it up frowned at her screen, said the edit log showed no timestamp, no user ID, nothing that should have been possible in a system that logged every keystroke. That's not normal, the clerk admitted quietly, before Vincent's assistant appeared at the doorway and the conversation ended. It was a small thing, a system that shouldn't have failed and had, but Marlene filed it away the way she filed away everything that didn't add up. She found Dante waiting outside, alone, no SUVs in sight, which told her he'd made a deliberate choice not to be seen. He looked, for the first time since she'd met him, less like a man in control of a situation and more like a man trying to survive one. Eli is safe, he said first before she could ask. He was with Ruth the whole time. There was a change in security protocol I made without telling either of them why, and it caused a delay. I take responsibility for that. You scared a 9-year-old and cost me my job in the same morning, Marlene said. And you're telling me it was a protocol issue. I'm telling you the truth as much as I safely can. That's not the same thing. She held up the coin-sized magnet she'd finally pulled from her toolbox that morning, turning it over in the light. This was on my bus. Under the wheel well, where nobody would look unless they knew exactly where to check. I don't think it's district property. Dante went still in a way that told her more than any explanation could have. He took it from her palm carefully, turned it once, and something in his expression shifted from controlled concern into something colder. I've seen this model before, he said quietly. It's not the kind of equipment outsiders use. It's the kind my own people use, to track vehicles they're supposed to be protecting. He looked up at her. Which means whoever put this here had access to information only a small circle of people should have had. Meaning someone close to you. Meaning, Dante said, someone I trusted enough not to check. He didn't say Vincent's name yet. He wasn't ready to believe it, not out loud, not to a stranger who'd known his nephew for 4 months and known him for 4 hours. But Marlene watched him do the math anyway. Watched the same instinct she used on her own brake lines play out across his face. Something had been tampered with, quietly, by someone with access, and he had been too certain of his own control to check. Marlene told him about the edit log with no timestamp, the file that had changed itself without leaving a trace anyone could point to. Dante listened without interrupting, and when she finished he said quietly, "That's not something a school district system does on its own. That takes someone with real access or someone paying for it." He didn't say Vincent's name. He was still, Marlene realized, protecting a version of his own organization that might not exist anymore. "I need my job back," Marlene said, because underneath everything else, that fact hadn't moved. "My son needs medication that costs more than I make in a week without insurance. I didn't ask to be part of whatever this is. But I'm not going to pretend I don't know what I know now either." "I can fix the insurance," Dante said. Quietly. Immediately. "I don't want it fixed quietly," Marlene said. "I want it fixed honestly on the record, the way it would be fixed for anyone else, because the second you start solving my problems in the dark, I become one more person who owes you something they can't ever pay back." I've seen how that goes for people in your world. I don't want it. Dante studied her for a long moment, the way a man studies something he hadn't planned for and isn't sure yet how to categorize. Most people take the easier offer, he said. I'm not most people, Marlene said. And your nephew doesn't need one more adult in his life who makes decisions about him instead of with him. He needs someone to tell him the truth. Starting with you. Dante didn't answer that directly. But he pocketed the magnet, and for the first time since the sedan had parked outside stop 4, Marlene saw him look genuinely uncertain about which of his own people he could still trust. The reversal came from the last place Marlene expected, Ridgeview's aging security guard, a heavy-set, quiet man named Harold who'd worked the front desk for 11 years and who Marlene had always assumed was as harmless as the coffee machine he guarded more carefully than the front doors. She found him 3 days into her suspension, restless and needing something to do with her hands, cross-referencing the district's visitor logs the way she'd once cross-referenced brake maintenance records. Methodically, looking for the thing that didn't belong. Vincent Ortolan's name appeared on the sign-in sheet 11 times that semester. 11 visits for a guardianship matter that, according to the actual court file Marlene had asked a lawyer friend to pull, didn't legally exist. There was no guardianship case. There never had been. She confronted Harold not with accusation, but with the same quiet directness she used on kids who'd broken a bus rule and were waiting to see whether she'd yell. He's been paying you, she said. For Eli's schedule. Which mornings he rides. Which afternoons he stays late for tutoring, when Ruth's usually running behind. Harold's face did the thing guilty faces do. Not defiance, just tired relief at finally being caught. He said it was for security, he said. Said the family needed to know the boy's patterns to keep him safe. I didn't think. He stopped. I didn't think it through. Whose security? Marlene asked. His or Eli's? Harold didn't have an answer, and that silence was its own confession. I need it in writing, Marlene said, not unkindly. Not because I want you to lose your job over this, Harold. Because a boy nearly got taken off my bus by a stranger, and somebody needs to be able to explain on paper exactly how that almost happened. Harold hesitated a long moment, glanced toward the front office where Vincent's name still sat pleasantly on a visitor badge from his last appointment, and then nodded. I'll write it tonight, he said. I should have said something the first time it felt wrong. I just didn't want to lose the extra money. It wasn't an excuse Marlene could fully forgive, but it was at least the truth. And the truth she was learning was the only currency that mattered now. Marlene brought what she had to Dante that evening, in the back office of a diner he'd apparently used for quiet meetings for years. Plain, unremarkable, exactly the kind of place nobody watching for a Mafia boss would think to check. She laid it out the way she'd lay out a maintenance report. The tracker, the visitor logs, the non-existent court case, Harold's admission. Dante read it all without speaking, and when he finally looked up, the composure Marlene had seen in him from the first moment cracked open into something raw. I've suspected Vincent for almost a year, he said. Small things. Numbers that didn't quite reconcile. Loyalty tests he ran that felt aimed at me instead of for me. I told myself I was being paranoid, because the alternative was admitting I'd built my entire organization around trusting the wrong man for 11 years. He set the papers down. I chose not to look because looking meant I'd have to act, and acting meant tearing apart something I didn't know how to rebuild. So instead you hid your nephew in an ordinary life and told almost nobody the truth, Marlene said, not cruelly but not gently either. Including him. I thought secrecy was the same as protection. You also thought loyalty tests aimed at you instead of for you were just Vincent being thorough, Marlene said. You've been making excuses for him for a year because admitting the truth meant admitting you'd misjudged the man closest to you. I understand that. I've made the same mistake with people I trusted to fix my own car instead of checking the work myself. But you don't get to keep making that excuse now that a child is the one paying for it. Dante flinched, just slightly, and Marlene realized it was the first time she'd seen him take a criticism without immediately defending himself. It isn't, Marlene said. I've watched that boy memorize the emergency exits on a school bus like it's a survival skill. He knows something is wrong. He's known for a long time. You just never gave him the words for it, so he built his own. Dante didn't answer right away. When he did, his voice had lost its usual control. If I confront Vincent directly, he has 11 years of loyalty in that organization, and a story ready to make me look like the one who's lost his grip. If I don't, he keeps using Eli as leverage until he finds a way to force the succession he wants. He looked at Marlene like he was asking a real question, not a rhetorical one. What would you do? I wouldn't disappear again, Marlene said. You've been solving this the same way for 9 years. Moving Eli, hiding the truth, hoping distance keeps him safe. It hasn't worked. It's just made him easier to isolate, because nobody around him actually knows what they're protecting him from. She tapped the visitor log. You have proof now. Real proof, not suspicion. Use it in the open, in front of the people whose trust Vincent's been quietly poisoning, instead of handling it in the dark the way he handles everything. That's not how these things are usually settled. I didn't ask how they're usually settled, Marlene said. I asked what you're going to do. Dante was quiet for a long moment, turning the visitor log over in his hands the way Marlene had turned the tracking magnet over in hers. When he finally spoke, it wasn't agreement, not yet, but it was the first crack in 9 years of instinctive concealment. If I do this your way, he said, and it's public, there's no controlling how Vincent responds. He could make a move against Eli directly, out of desperation, before I can stop him. Then we don't give him room to be desperate in private, Marlene said. We make sure the exposure happens somewhere he can't turn it into violence without everyone watching him do it. It wasn't a plan yet, but it was the first time in the entire ordeal that Dante Reyes had let someone outside his organization help him think, instead of simply deciding alone and expecting to be trusted for it. Before they parted that night, Dante told her one more thing, almost reluctantly, as though it cost him to say it out loud. Eli asked me once months ago whether it was his fault that Ruth always looked tired and scared. I told him no and changed the subject, because I didn't know how to explain the real answer without frightening him more. He looked at Marlene. I still don't know how to do that. Explaining it without frightening him. You don't do it all at once, Marlene said. You do it the way you'd teach a kid to check a bus for an emergency exit. A little at a time, calmly, so it becomes something he knows how to handle instead of something that just happens to him. Dante nodded slowly, like a man filing away an instruction he intended to actually use. The plan Marlene proposed was almost stubbornly ordinary, which was exactly why it worked. Ridgeview Unified held a family safety night every spring, a mandatory well-attended event where the district reviewed bus procedures, emergency protocols, and answered parent questions in a gymnasium full of folding chairs and fluorescent light. Vincent Ortolan, in his role as the Marchetti family's legal representative, had already arranged to attend and speak briefly about guardianship transition support, a request Griggs had approved without a second thought, because Vincent was, on every visible record, a cooperative and reasonable man. He didn't know Marlene knew that. He didn't know he'd handed her the exact room, the exact audience, and the exact appearance of ordinary procedure she needed. Building the case took 4 days. Marlene's evidence system stayed simple, the way she ran everything. No scattered documents, no theories that couldn't be said in one clear sentence. There was the tracking magnet, traced by Dante's own people to a batch of equipment signed out under Vincent's authorization 8 months earlier. There was Harold's written statement, given freely once he understood what silence had nearly cost a child. There was the visitor log proving 11 meetings tied to a guardianship case that had never existed in any court record. And there was one more piece Marlene brought herself, a payroll and expense record pulled with permission by her son's godmother Denise, who worked in the district's finance office and had noticed a small recurring security consulting payment routed through a shell account that traced back to Vincent. Money that had, for months, quietly funded the very surveillance used against Eli. For pieces. Nothing more. Marlene had learned enough about her own life to know that too much evidence only muddied a truth that was, underneath it all, simple. A man had used a child to force a war he wanted, and he'd paid people to help him do it. Denise was nervous about pulling the payroll trace at first, It wasn't strictly her job, and she'd have to explain if anyone asked why she'd gone looking. Marlene didn't pressure her. She just told her the truth. A 9-year-old had almost been taken off a bus by a stranger, and the money trail might be the one piece that made the difference between Vincent talking his way out of the room and Vincent being unable to. Denise thought about it overnight, then came back the next morning with a printed page and a simple sentence. "I have a godson too," she said. "I'd want somebody to do this for him." Dante wanted, at first, to handle Vincent the way his world usually handled betrayal. Quietly, permanently, before the safety night ever happened. 2 of his captains, men who'd known him since before Eli was born, argued for exactly that, calling Marlene's plan naive, too public, too easy for Vincent to twist. Dante listened to them for the better part of an hour, and for a while Marlene genuinely believed he'd choose the familiar path over the harder one. Marlene didn't plead with him. She just asked one direct question. "If you do that, what does Eli learn about what protection means?" Dante didn't answer for a long time. Then he called off the plan his men had already begun preparing, and it cost him more than money. It cost him the certainty, in front of his own captains, that violence was still the fastest and safest answer. 2 of his oldest lieutenants openly disagreed with him. He held the line anyway. He also had to decide in those same 4 days what to tell Eli. A smaller decision than the confrontation itself, but in some ways the harder one. Ruth wanted to keep the boy entirely away from the safety night, sheltered in a hotel room until it was over. Dante considered it, then found himself asking, for the first time in 9 years, what Eli himself wanted, instead of deciding on his behalf. Eli's answer was simple and steady in a way that startled both adults. He wanted to know what was happening, even if he didn't come to the gym himself. So Dante sat with him at the kitchen table of the safe apartment Ruth kept, and told him, in plain sentences suited to a 9-year-old and not a courtroom, that a man he'd trusted had used Eli's schedule to hurt people, and that Marlene and others were going to make sure it stopped. Eli listened without interrupting, the same careful attention he gave a bus route, and when Dante finished, he asked only one question. "Is Marlene going to be okay?" It wasn't the question Dante had braced for, and it told him, more than anything else that week, how much the boy had come to trust the one adult in his life who'd never once managed him from a distance. "You're choosing something harder," Marlene told him the night before the event, over a kitchen table meal she hadn't meant to invite him to but somehow had, grilled cheese and canned soup, because that was what she had in the house, and Caleb was upstairs doing homework, blissfully unaware that the quiet man at their kitchen table ran half the city's underworld. "I'm choosing something I don't know how to do," Dante admitted. "I've never let anyone see me lose control of a situation in public before." "You're not losing control," Marlene said. "You're finally sharing it. There's a difference, even if it doesn't feel like one yet." He looked in that moment, less like the man who'd stepped out of a black SUV with total authority, and more like someone quietly recalculating everything he thought he knew about strength. He didn't reach for her hand. He didn't say anything that sounded like romance. But when Caleb came downstairs for water and Dante asked him, plainly, how school was going, not performing warmth, just offering it, Marlene understood that whatever was growing between them wasn't built on danger or rescue. It was built on the ordinary, unglamorous fact that he was capable of sitting at her table and being honest. "One condition," Marlene said before he left that night. "Eli doesn't find out any of this by accident, ever again. Not from a tracker under a bus. Not from a stranger in a gray coat. If something threatens him, he hears it from you, in words he can understand, before he has to figure it out alone." "Agreed," Dante said, and meant it in a way Marlene could hear. The next morning she went to the depot, retrieved her bus keys from Griggs's desk, reinstated the day before on the record, after the district reviewed Harold's statement and quietly realized how close they'd come to handing a child to an imposter, and drove her route one more time before the evening's event, past Stop 4, past the empty curb where a sedan no longer waited, carrying 26 children safely to school exactly on schedule. The gymnasium was full by 7 o'clock, parents in folding chairs, a district safety officer at a podium, Griggs near the back looking more nervous than the fire drill review usually warranted. Dante sat near the exit with two of his captains, deliberately unremarkable, the way he'd learned to be in rooms he didn't control. Vincent Ortolan arrived exactly on time in a good suit, carrying a folder of prepared remarks about supporting families through guardianship transitions, smiling at the receptionist by name on his way in. Marlene stood at the back near her bus keys, not the podium, because this wasn't about performing authority. It was about a driver doing what she'd done for 6 years, noticing something that didn't belong and saying so clearly. When the safety officer opened the floor for questions after Vincent's brief, polished remarks, Marlene raised her hand. "I have a question about a specific guardianship case," she said. "Since Mr. Ortolan mentioned supporting transitions, I'd like to ask about Eli Marchetti." Vincent's smile didn't move, but something behind his eyes recalculated. "Of course," he said smoothly. "Though I'd prefer to discuss individual family matters privately, out of respect for—" "I checked," Marlene said, "with the county court. There is no guardianship case on file for Eli Marchetti. There never has been." She held up a single printed page. Not a stack, one page, the way she'd learned mattered. "But there is a visitor log showing 11 meetings between you and district staff this year, and a tracking device pulled from the underside of my school bus that traces back to equipment your own signature authorized 8 months ago." A ripple moved through the room, parents shifting, the safety officer's pen stopping mid-note. Griggs stood up slowly near the back. "That tracker could belong to any number of vendors," Vincent said, recovering fast. His voice pitched for the room rather than for Marlene. "And a signature doesn't prove intent. I authorize dozens of equipment orders in the course of ordinary work. As for the guard statement, a man under financial pressure will say a great many things to explain a lapse in judgment that was entirely his own." "That's true," Marlene said evenly. "Which is why I didn't bring you a signature alone, or a statement alone. I brought you all 4 because each one only means something once you see how they connect. The tracker explains how they knew which mornings to watch. The visitor log explains how they got access to make it look official. The guard statement explains who was paid to feed the schedule. And the payroll trace explains where that money actually came from. An account with your name on the authorization, not a vendor's, not a stranger's. Yours." She let the room sit with that. "I don't need you to admit it, Mr. Ortolan. I just need everyone here to look at the same 4 pages I did and reach the same simple conclusion I reached." "This is an inappropriate venue for unfounded accusations," Vincent said. His voice still even, still reasonable, but tighter now, a man recalculating faster than his mask could keep pace with. "They're not unfounded." Marlene set the second page beside the first. Harold's signed statement. "Your school's security guard has confirmed in writing that you paid him to report a child's schedule under the pretense of protecting him. And this," she set down the third page, the payroll trace Denise had pulled, "shows the payments came from an account that also funded the surveillance used to isolate that same child from his guardian long enough to attempt taking him from a school bus." Vincent's eyes moved finally to Dante, sitting quiet and still near the exit. "This is beneath you," Vincent said, and for the first time his composure genuinely slipped. "Letting a bus driver do your talking." "She's not doing my talking," Dante said, standing, his voice carrying without needing to rise. "She's telling the truth in a room you thought you controlled. I let her because for 11 years I let you handle uncomfortable things in the dark, and I never once asked what that was costing the people around me. That ends tonight." "You're choosing sentiment over the organization," Vincent said, low now, urgent, the mask fully gone. "I was protecting what you built by making sure it had a leader willing to act. You hide a child in a public school and call it protection. I call it weakness." "You call it weakness," Dante said, "because you needed him vulnerable to force the fight you wanted. That's not protecting the organization. That's using a 9-year-old as a lever." He nodded once to the 2 captains near him. Not a threat, a signal, the kind that meant the matter was already decided within the structure Vincent himself had helped build. "You're removed from every position of trust, effective immediately, under the same rules you've enforced against other men for less. Not with violence." with the same evidence you'd have demanded from anyone else. It wasn't a dramatic ending, not the kind with drawn weapons or a car chase. It was quieter than that and more permanent. A room full of witnesses, a paper trail that couldn't be argued with, and a man who'd spent 11 years controlling every uncomfortable outcome in private finding himself, for the first time, undone in the open by evidence a school bus driver had assembled with a mechanic's patience. Vincent's two allies among the captains, the same men who'd argued for a quieter, harsher solution days earlier, said nothing in his defense. Whatever loyalty they'd felt toward him evaporated the moment the evidence made his ambition impossible to mistake for anything else. He left the gymnasium under his own power, flanked at a distance rather than dragged, and Marlene understood that Dante had kept his word. No violence, no spectacle beyond the truth itself, just an organization enforcing its own rules in the open for what felt, to everyone watching, like the first time in a long time. The district safety officer, once the room settled, confirmed on the spot that Marlene's suspension would be formally cleared and her incident reports expunged, given what Harold's statement revealed about the district's own security failure. Griggs shook her hand afterward, quietly, the way tired men do when they realize someone else had been right the whole time. Marlene found Eli near the gym's side door afterward, sitting with Ruth, watching the whole thing with the same careful attention he gave every bus route. "You didn't leave," he said, like he was still confirming it was true. "I told you I wouldn't," Marlene said. "I don't know everything about your uncle's world, and I don't need to. But I know a promise when I make one, and I keep mine." Eli nodded, slow and serious, and for the first time in 4 months, Marlene watched him actually relax his shoulders on the way out the door. 2 months later, Route 14 ran the same way it always had. 26 kids, one careful count at every stop, Marlene checking her own brake lines before every shift out of habit rather than necessity now. Vincent Ortolan was gone from the territory entirely. The organization's own internal accounting, made public enough within its ranks to matter, had done more to end his influence than any threat could have. Nobody Marlene spoke to seemed to know exactly where he'd resettled, and for the first time in this whole ordeal, that felt less like an unanswered question and more like a closed one. Ridgeview Unified had new protocols by fall. Guardianship changes now required in-person verification at the district office, not a signed form and a stranger's word, a small procedural fix that existed because one driver's incident reports had turned out, every time, to be right. Marlene's route was made permanent on the record, with her insurance restored the ordinary, unglamorous way. Through her job, not through anyone's quiet favor. Caleb's medication never missed a refill. Eli talked more now. Not constantly. He was still a careful, watchful boy who'd probably always notice exits before he noticed anything else in a room, but enough that his teacher mentioned it to Marlene at pickup one afternoon, surprised and pleased. Dante had stopped managing his nephew's life from a careful distance and started sitting with him instead, telling him, in pieces appropriate to a 9-year-old's understanding, why certain precautions existed and why others no longer needed to. Eli still memorized the bus's emergency exits. But he did it now, Marlene suspected, the way any careful kid might, rather than the way a child braces for a life he's never had explained to him. Dante came by the depot sometimes, unannounced but never uninvited, and Marlene had stopped being surprised by it. Their conversations stayed ordinary. Caleb's schoolwork, a bus repair Marlene was proud of finishing herself, Eli's stubborn insistence on a card game with rules he'd invented and refused to write down. There was no dramatic declaration between them, no rushed proposal, nothing that would have made a tidier ending. There was just a man who had learned, slowly and at real cost, that trust meant telling the truth even when silence felt safer, and a woman who had never needed rescuing, only the room to do what she'd have done for any child on her route. "I used to think protecting people meant deciding everything for them quietly," Dante told her once, standing by the bus after her last afternoon run, watching Eli race another kid across the schoolyard. "You didn't let me get away with that." "Good," Marlene said. "Because the version of protecting people where nobody gets a say in their own life isn't protection. It's just control with better manners." He didn't argue. He hadn't in a long time. Ruth stayed on too, no longer just a silent guardian but something closer to family friend, someone who dropped by on weekends and who Eli, slowly, started calling by name instead of the careful politeness he'd used before. Harold kept his job at the front desk, on the condition that he report directly to the district's safety office from then on rather than to any private visitor who asked nicely. A second chance Marlene had personally recommended, because she believed a man who told the truth eventually, at real cost to himself, deserved something better than losing everything over one bad year of judgment. That, in the end, was the story's real question. Not whether danger could be defeated, but whether the people meant to keep others safe were willing to trust them with the truth instead of managing them from a careful distance. Marlene had made her promise the first morning she refused to hand a frightened boy to a stranger with a folded paper and a reasonable voice. Dante had spent 9 years believing that promises like that were best kept in silence. It took a bus driver with a mechanic's patience and a mother's stubborn clarity to show him otherwise. Would you have refused to hand that child over, the way Marlene did, even knowing it could cost you your job? And was Dante right, all those years, to think that hiding the truth from the people he loved was the same thing as keeping them safe? Or did his silence put Eli in more danger than the truth ever could have? If this story moved you, share what you'd have done in Marlene's place in the comments, and consider subscribing for more stories about ordinary people who refuse to look away when it matters most.